Hello. And hello to the youth in the back. Hello. What's up, guys? I always love being able to bring a message to your wonderful church. And I love being able to teach your youth every single week. They learn from me and I learn from them every single Sunday. As I normally preach on a chapter of the Bible, of a book, today I'm going to focus on an entire book of the Bible. Today we are going to look at the book of Ruth. We will go over the story of Ruth, but we will pay more attention to Ruth chapter 2. Before we do that, I want to give a quick overview of Ruth chapter 1. So let's do that first. In Ruth chapter 1, we see a man named Elimelech. He takes his wife Naomi and their 2 sons out of Bethlehem into Moab because of a bad famine that was going on at the time. The 2 sons take 2 wives in the land of Moab. We see here that Ruth is from that land, from the Moabites. Moab has a very negative history, especially when it comes to Moabite women. The Moabites began with Lot's incestuous relationship with his daughter. That's not a very good start for a people. Later, we see a group of Moabite women who seduced Israelite men into immorality, and as a result, the Lord struck down many Israelite men. You were not supposed to go near a Moabite woman or the Moabites in general. But Elimelech it seemed that this was necessary because of the famine to go into Moab. So we see Elimelech's sons married 2 Moabite women. Their names are Ruth and Orpah. And before they ever have any sons or children, Elimelech and his 2 sons die, leaving a bitter mother-in-law with 2 Moabite daughter-in-laws. Naomi says that she would want to go back to her people, so she left and went back to her people. Orpah says that she wants to stay back with her mother-in-law, and that's understandably why. But Ruth tells Naomi that she will follow Naomi and the God Naomi serves, rather than going back to her family. So Naomi and Ruth come back to Bethlehem in chapter 1, at the end of chapter 1. The 2 women are desperate. They have no food. They have no family. They have no heirs. They have nothing. All they have is this little bit of hope at the start of chapter 2. And we'll read that in just a second. And now most of us here have heard this story, and maybe multiple times. But Naomi and Ruth had no idea what was in store for them. They had no idea what was going to happen, and they were very, very desperate. I'd like to point out here that we actually see this a lot in Scripture, where God uses something like extreme tragedy to set the stage for something amazing to happen. God still does this today. There are still times, maybe in every single one of our lives here, where God allows some kind of suffering to happen, something that we would never want it to happen, but we see that God has used that to create something wonderful and amazing. So often, when difficulties and suffering happen in our lives, we are so focused of trying to run away from that. But we forget that God is bigger than our circumstances. And He can use those tragedies, and oftentimes allows those tragedies to happen, to make us victors. If you're going through a tragedy, or the next time you go through suffering, just remember that God will use it for something amazing. So be on the lookout for that. Look and see how God can mold you and form you to become someone you never thought you could be. Sometimes in tragedy, we feel that God is far from us, but instead He is right there beside us, setting the stage for something miraculous to happen. So let's go through and we'll read in verse 2. We'll just read one verse right now. Ruth 2, verse 1. Ruth 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. The word kinsman there is redeemer. Redeemer. Let's stop for a second in that verse and look at two things. First, we see that Boaz is a part of the family of Elimelech. Second, we see that Boaz was a worthy man. This is probably talking about both wealth and his character. So we see Boaz come into the story. So let's go on and read Ruth 2, verses 2 through 7. 2 through 7. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, "Please let me go into the field and glean among the ears of the grain, after one of whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she departed and went and gleaned into the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servants, "Who was in charge of these reapers? Whose young woman is this?" The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. In the time of the harvest and gathering what was planted before, many would intentionally drop some of what they were picking up on the ground. They would do that on purpose, leaving some for those who were poor to come up and have something as well. This is how they took care of the poor in those times. This is one way they did that. Ruth knew this and thought this would be a good way for them to have food, so she left for Boaz's land. We also see that Boaz notices her and shows interest in knowing who she is and where she's from. So the worker answered Boaz, letting him know that Ruth was the one who takes care of Naomi, but that she is one who no one takes care of and who no one provides for. So let's read on, verses 8 through 13. Verses 8 through 13. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go and glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be in the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you're thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me. Then how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth, and came to the people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." So we know Ruth has written to show how God looks and redeems his people. We know that's why the book of Ruth was written. We see Boaz and how he looks at Ruth and how he shows compassion to Ruth and how he acts toward her. The first thing we learn about God here is that God seeks those who are lost in sin, who are desperate, and he sees them as family. God actively looks to those who are in desperate spiritual need and longs for them to be a part of his family, even though they see themselves as foreigners. There are no foreigners to God. All of humanity is created in the image of God, and God sees all people worth dying for. God has no favorites, but loves all equally. Not based on what anyone does, but based simply that he created us. We also see here that Boaz saved Ruth from harm. Apparently, it can be dangerous to go out and pick up after the harvest. It looks like the women in this predicament maybe could be abused or taken advantage of in some way. But Boaz told the men not to touch her. And it goes even further to tell Ruth to only come to his field where it's safer. Not only that, he tells her to drink the water that the young men have drawn. And her answer was to bow down to the ground in awe, asking, "Why would you favor me?" She is completely overwhelmed, and understandably so, that the one over the harvest, the one over the fields, has sought her out, has protected her, has given her food, has given her water, and now allowed her to continue doing so. And Ruth answered and said, "I am lower than even your servants, and yet you have sought favor in me." Ruth was not family to Boaz. Naomi was. And yet Boaz saw Ruth and treated her as family. Even though we are sinners, undeserving and not worthy of being saved, God sees us even before we ever accept him in our lives. God sees us as family, worth loving, and sending his son to die for us. Let's move on to Ruth 2:14 through 17. Ruth 2:14 through 17. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied, and even had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, "Let her glean among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also, you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it, that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And now we see Boaz has gone even further in his grace towards Ruth. She has eaten a meal with Boaz, given her the same food he eats. Even more gracious, he allows her to come and gather from his fields any time. And the workers are to leave some of the harvest, especially for Ruth. And when Ruth leaves, she comes home to Naomi with at least a half a month's wages of barley. So let's go on and read verses 18 through 20. She took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. Her mother-in-law then said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead." And Naomi said to her, "The man is a relative. He is one of our closest relatives. He is a redeemer." And here we see Naomi has completely changed. Before, we see her as an older woman who was very, very bitter, probably even at God many times. The woman has lost her husband and her two sons and is now without anything before they come back to Bethlehem. She is hoping Ruth will come back with at least enough for a meal, but instead, Ruth comes back with enough to feed them for a half a month or more. At the end of verse 20, Naomi says that Boaz is one of their redeemers. This word is important here and is the most important theme in the book of Ruth. A redeemer is someone who can pay the price to bring someone else into the family, to claim that what was once the redeemer's is now for the one who is redeemed as well. One who is redeemed cannot redeem themselves, but must have a redeemer. This is how God saves us as well. Even though most of us in this room are probably believers, we need to be reminded of this often, that God saves the lost by redeeming them. A lost person has nothing to give to God. They do not deserve anything from God. God does not owe them anything, and God will not get anything from them in return once He redeems them. And yet His love is so strong that He is willing to send His Son on a cross to die for us and, in effect, redeem us. So now we see that at the beginning of chapter 2, they are poor, they're without money, they're really without much hope of other than one meal. And at the end of the chapter, not only do they have enough food for half a month or more, they also have the hope of belonging to a new family that can provide them with everything they could ever need and more. And now we see that Naomi starts to make a plan. She starts planning. She makes a plan, one that would even be a little inappropriate as well. But Boaz would not allow her to do that. He would not allow that to happen. Instead, Boaz knew of another relative, one who was closer related to Elimelech than Boaz was. Boaz went to the other relative who was willing to redeem them as well. Boaz asked him, and he said, "Yes, I'm willing to redeem them." The other relative was willing to redeem them up until Boaz tells the relative that Ruth is a Moabite woman. This is where the relative says no. He will not redeem her because she is a Moabite woman. So Boaz steps up and redeems and marries Ruth. And what was once a desolate story ends with redemption and love. Boaz and Ruth both have a son. They have a son named Obed. Obed ended up being the grandfather of David, King David. Not only was Ruth redeemed, she got to become one of the women who brought in the lineage of David and ultimately Jesus. This woman who saw herself as a foreigner from a land of people looked down upon and from a very negative history, God saw her as a daughter and used her in an amazing way, being a part of bringing in the Messiah who would save the world. And this story is not just about a man redeeming a woman. The story is about how God redeems His people through an amazing lineage of redemption, leading to Jesus Himself. So if you were to turn to Matthew 1:5, we won't do that right now, but if you were to look at Matthew 1:5, and you looked at the line of people who brought Jesus into the world, you will see a Moabite woman named Ruth in the lineage of the Son of God. Why Ruth was in the line, or why was Ruth in the line of those people? Why did she get to do that? It is the same reason that God has saved us. Because God is gracious in mercy and wonderful. We were once as well people who were lost in sin, who were without hope, who did not know what was in store for us. But but God poured his love on us with grace and mercy and redeemed us when we had nothing to offer him in return. Sometimes God gives us very difficult decisions to make. And oftentimes, those decisions will not ultimately provide the outcome that we want right away. It would have been very difficult. It would have been a very difficult decision for Ruth to make, to follow Naomi, rather than go back to her parents and the gods she used to serve. But it tells us here in chapter 1 that Ruth decided to follow Naomi and the God Naomi served. Ruth could not leave her newfound belief in God, even if that meant choosing a lifestyle of poverty and leaving her mom and dad. Sometimes God will call us to make hard decisions with outcomes that seem bleak or not what we want. But none of this would have happened to Ruth if she did not choose God over everything else. So what is it that you would choose over God? What is it that you would choose God over as well? What is it that you would choose over God? Is there something that you need to give up or a decision you need to make that you've been choosing over God? If so, now is the time to let that go or to make that difficult decision. We may not know the future, but we can know that God is in control. If we live in obedience to him, he will be there with us and give us exactly what we need and when we need it, and maybe even more, as he did with Ruth. There's one more thing I want to touch on here, and that is that we as believers should be completely captivated to the mystery of mercy. The mystery of mercy. Let's think about the context that maybe you were born in, and it very well may be the same context you were born in. I was born and I grew up. I never went without food or water or health care or shelter or poverty. I was born into a context where I have essentially heard the gospel ever since I was born. And I had nothing to do with where I was born. But there are billions of people who are born in a context where they do have to worry about food or shelter or medical care. Hundreds of millions who struggle with starvation, and nearly 2 billion people who have little or no access to the gospel. And those people have had nothing to do with where they were born either. So that makes me ask, God, why me? Why have you allowed this for me? Why was this given to me? And that's a mystery. And it makes me ask, God, why is it that you have blessed and given the people in this room the opportunities they have? And that is a mystery. This is a mysterious mercy. And I do not know the answer as to why me and why you. But I do know that those of us who are captivated by the mystery of mercy are now compelled to a ministry of mercy. Since we have been shown mercy, while hundreds of millions have not been shown the same, we are to return that mercy and in the way God has called us to. That starts with the people we work with, the people we live with, the people we see on a daily basis. We are not to do this because we feel guilty, but because we have been redeemed by Christ, and we want others to be as well. This is what can drive us. There are many people who want to do good in this world for justice, or because they feel guilt, or to try and be a better person, but this is not what drives us. What drives us is that we have been redeemed by God. We were once dead in our sin, lost without hope, and we were redeemed. So we want others to experience this as well. May this be our single most important passion, and may this be what drives us as Christians And may this be what drives GlowNet Church. Let's pray. Lord, we come to you right now. And we recognize that we recognize all the things that you've blessed us with. Everything we have is from you, God. And there are people in this world who have just not been blessed as we have. We thank you that you've given us the opportunity to hear the gospel over and over again. We thank you that we've had the opportunities to say yes to that, God. But I pray that we would realize that others do not get that chance, God. So for those of us who you've shown mercy to, God, may we show much mercy to others. For those of us that you've blessed, God, may we in return bless others. And may your love overflow through us. Amen.